The French language has gone on a pretty wild ride. Nowadays, we see French as one singular language with clear rules and solid grammar. On top of that, we see French as classy. It's the language of international prestige and the pride of the French people. But historically speaking, this attitude towards French is actually pretty new. Before the 12th century, French was not seen as the main language of France. It was one of many powerful regional languages, including Breton, Occitan, and Alsatian. Before the 16th century, French was not respected that much in France. It was seen as second string to the purity of Latin, as French was a weird Frankenstein of many different languages. But by the time you get to the 18th century, French was the dominant language of the world, the language of diplomacy, culture, science, and education. So this begs the question, how has French gotten to where it is today? The short answer is that French has been in contact, in competition, and in conflict with lots of different languages. And it's these interactions that have pushed French to be where it is today. So here's a very brief history of French, adapted from this not very brief history of French, all broken into 5 chapters from the origins of French to its current standings in the 21st century. Let's go. Imagine for a second that you're a Roman soldier from the 2nd century BCE. You look kind of like this. You're brave, you wear sick armor, you kind of smell. Remember, this is 2,000 years before Axe body spray. And he just arrived in a new part of the Roman Empire called Gaul. In Gaul, the people speak Gaulish, a Celtic language. But as a good Roman soldier, you and your buddies all chat in Latin. Latin is the language of the government, the administration, the education. But Gaulish doesn't just die out when Latin arrives. No. Instead, Gaulish starts to mix with Latin. And your children and grandchildren start speaking a Latin that sounds different from yours. This is basically how the French language started. Under Roman rule, Gaul had 2 big languages, Gaulish and this vulgar Latin. Latin came to be seen as the language of power and urban centers, and even locals would start to learn Latin so they could get ahead and get nice jobs with the administration. Gaulish, on the other hand, was pushed more to the countryside, so it started to get this connotation of being a bit of a hick language. By the 5th century AD, Gaulish had begun to die out, but the region's Latin had already absorbed a lot of Gaulish, like the words for sheep, cradle, and mud. As a result, their Latin was starting to look less and less like pure Latin. And this trend would only become more and more pronounced over the coming centuries. Soon the Roman Empire fell, and there was a power vacuum in Gaul. Lots of different European powers came in and out of the region, bringing with them their own changes to the language. One of these groups was the Franks. When the Franks invaded in the 5th century, they changed the language a lot. Vulgar Latin started to adopt all these Germanic stress patterns and vocabulary, which explains in part why French is so special in comparison to the other Romance languages. The Franks also brought with them a bunch of linguistic concepts. For instance, in Latin there aren't very complex words for colors, so the Franks introduced the words for blue, brown, and blonde. Even the name of the language, Français, comes from the Franks. Later though, we see even more changes to the language. Viking conquests in the north of France introduced lots of seafaring words like wave and deck, and contact with England gave words like boat and the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. The result of all of this is that this weird Latin-Gaulish combo got further and further away from pure Latin. It was a Frankenstein of different languages, and this is where a distinct French language starts to emerge.
It's alive!
By the late 8th century, this language was completely distinct from Latin. Now it would be called Old French, and here's where things start to get interesting. We gotta recognize though that this French that we're talking about is not the only unique language in France at the time. You also got a ton of other languages, some with radically different roots. In the south, you've got Occitan, which is a completely different Romance language, kind of like Catalan. In the west, you've got Alsatian, which is like a funky mix of German and French. And by the Pyrenees Mountains, you've got Basque, which has completely different roots from all of the other languages, not even being an Indo-European language. But when we say the word French nowadays, we're only really referring to one language, the oui oui baguette French. Historians now call this language Francian, and it started out as just one of these dozens of mini languages. So how did this one specific language become the default French language? Well, Francian didn't originate from just anywhere. It was the dialect of the Paris region. And even back in the 12th century, Paris still had a lot of influence. Paris had everything you needed to centralize power. It was a permanent capital with a royal court, a law court, a university, and a religious hub. Their version of French, and the family of similar languages in the north, started to be known as the langue d'oil. Oil being their primitive way of saying yes, oui. If the north was going strong with his langue d'oil, the south was on a completely different page, speaking primarily the langue d'oc. Oc being their way of saying yes. Think hoc from Latin. To generalize a little bit, these langues d'oc were basically Occitan and a lot of different dialects. And these southerners were just as proud of their language as the northerners. In fact, Occitan was well known for its poetry during the Middle Ages and was the main language of the troubadours. So if Occitan also had this really rich history, why isn't Occitan the official French language? Well, the northern langue d'oil started to take over, not by peace, but by force. You see, in the 13th century, the North was strongly aligned with the Catholic Church, and they started to look down south and notice that these darn Southerners were tolerating this new movement of Christianity called Catharism. And so the Northerners were all like, no way, stop doing that weird new Christianity knockoff. And remember, this is during the time of the Crusades. The church was not messing around. So when they looked down south and they saw those filthy heretics, they felt that they needed to take action. Thus started a 20-year attack on the south called the Albigensian Crusade. And this Albigensian Crusade was honestly brutal. So brutal that the guy who coined the word genocide called these crusades, quote, one of the most conclusive cases of genocide in religious history. But the thing is, these crusades didn't even really work to get rid of these heretics. The result was, though, that now the south was under the rule of the French crown. And from this point onward, these northern langues d'oil would start to play a bigger and bigger role in the south of France. Soon, Francian would be the language of official business all across France. Of course, languages like Occitan didn't just disappear, no. They stayed in these regions and were the everyday languages for centuries to come. In fact, even today, there are people who speak languages like Basque, Alsatian, and Occitan, and these people are very proud to protect their language and culture. However, after the 13th century, all these languages would slowly lose their chance of becoming the official language of the French nation. So the French language was getting more and more powerful. However, its biggest hurdle was still ahead of it, and it would spark a national debate that would divide the French people. Okay, so I said that Latin stopped being the language that people spoke in their day-to-day, and that's true. But that doesn't mean that it disappeared altogether. Actually, quite the opposite. For centuries, nearly everything was written in Latin because they thought Latin was objectively better than French. Sure, French was okay to speak in your day-to-day and maybe to write some literature in, but Latin was still the big dog when it came to anything like science, theology, diplomacy, and education. So even if French beat out these other dialects, it still had a competitor in Latin. After all, Latin had fixed rules. It was a quote-unquote pure, organized language. And on top of that, it had tradition, with roots that go all the way back to an enormous empire. French, on the other hand, was seen as this kind of new kid on the block, a shapeless bastardization of a bunch of different languages. So how did French beat Latin? Well, Latin's biggest strength was also its biggest weakness. You see, people loved Latin for its fixed grammar and rules, but it also meant that while French society was progressing, Latin could not change with it. They could either have a pure language or a modern one, not both. This growing disconnect between the Latin language and the changing times led to a series of controversial debates over the course of the 16th century. It was Latin versus French, and a ton of writers started to preach the crazy idea that maybe French was okay to use in more formal contexts. The poet Joachim du Bellay argued that Greek and Latin weren't always seen as these pure, dignified, rule-driven languages, and that maybe French too could one day be seen as prestigious. Humanists like Barthélemy Arnault and Guillaume des Hôtels went even further, arguing that French did not need to imitate other languages in the first place to be legitimate. They weren't trashing Latin, but they were saying, come on, let's at least give French a chance, because they knew that French was better suited to the times. And over the years, more and more people got convinced that the world wouldn't end if you started using French instead of Latin. So you start seeing French being used in all these scientific publications, historical documents, and theological texts. And this all culminated in the 1539 Ordinance of Villers-Cotterêts, which established French as the official language of France. Not Occitan, not Latin, and not any other languages. But this was just the beginning. And soon French would grow to be even larger than anybody had expected. Within a few centuries, French would come to be recognized as the universal language of the elites, spreading all across Europe and the world. It was taught to upper-class Europeans and widely spoken in the royal courts. How did this happen? How did French in particular become the European lingua franca by the end of the 17th century? Well, French had already had a good bit of success abroad. As early as the 13th century, French literature had begun to export abroad with pretty great success. So much so that even in the year 1250, this Norwegian book urged people to learn Latin and French, quote, because they are the most widely known. So this gave French this artsy and practical appeal. And by the 16th century, French already had considerable soft power in Europe. But you've also got to remember that France was massive at this time, 1/6 the total population of Europe. On top of that, France had a strong military and economy. Plus, it was starting to become one of the most standardized languages in Europe. After all, 1634 marked the creation of the Académie Française, an organization with the sole purpose of establishing the rules of the French language once and for all. So it would make sense that this language would cinch the status of lingua franca. It's during the 18th century that French became the official language of diplomacy, putting another nail in the coffin of Latin. And French would only become more and more internationally influential over the next 2 centuries, thanks to the French Enlightenment philosophers, French writers, artists, and a bit of help from Napoleon to spread French language to the rest of the continent. By 1782, the French language was so widespread that the Berlin Academy held an essay competition about the question, what has made the French language universal? The winning essay by Antoine de Rivarol describes French syntax as incorruptible and writes, quote, that which is not clear is not French. So now French was seen as the language of prestige and clarity, which is only just a little bit ironic given that a few centuries before, it was seen as the messy, disorganized cousin of Latin. You also can't talk about the global impact of French without talking about its history of colonization. The French Empire reached across the world from Africa to the Americas. The colonized people would rarely speak French to each other in their day-to-day, as many held on to their mother tongues or spoke French Creole or patois, but still, French became the official language of the government and education in France's colonies, and would serve as a lingua franca between colonized people who did not necessarily speak the same language. Although these people did not particularly learn French by choice, this led to an explosion of French across West and North Africa, as well as parts of the Americas and Asia. So French had reached this peak of world power thanks to a mix of military might and artistic appeal. If you want a deeper look into the height of French influence, I recommend these videos about the super influential writers Victor Hugo and Arthur Rimbaud, or this French history of haute couture. All of these videos are available on FluentU, along with interactive subtitles so you can learn French while learning history. Master French while watching your favorite videos by trying our free trial, just by clicking on the link in the description below. Up until the 19th century, French looked impossible to beat. That is, until something unexpected started to happen that would shake the status of the langue universelle. At the height of French's power, we also see the language adopting more and more loanwords from English. This really starts in the mid-1800s. England was the first country to go through the Industrial Revolution, meaning they coined a bunch of technical terms that would soon be adopted into French. These words include railway terms like ticket, tunnel, and wagon, as well as textile terms like Macintosh and jersey. These English loanwords were limited to technical terms for a while, but by the time you get to World War II, the US had already started to emerge as a cultural superpower, flooding the rest of the world with its media, movies, and music. By the 1950s, French had picked up a lot of English words, from automobile to weekend. So many words, in fact, that the French coined a term for the phenomenon, franglais, a combination of français and anglais. And we all know what happened next. English would soon become the international standard, the go-to foreign language to learn, with French adopting more and more English terms. This has been a pretty controversial process in France, with heavy opposition to English and a fierce protection of the French language. As in René Etombre's essay Parlez-vous franglais, a scathing critique of Anglicisms published in 1964. Despite this perceived threat, the French language has held on strong, in part because it doesn't just adopt English terms willy-nilly. When French takes a word from English, it's only in a very specific meaning or connotation. Le puzzle, for example, only means a jigsaw puzzle, not any other kind of puzzle. And le girl only refers to a showgirl or choir girl. Instead of replacing French words altogether, these words complement the language and add nuance to specific terms. And for as much as French has taken from English, the French language continues to enrich the world. After all, as any marketing team is aware of, the French language is the language of prestige and luxury, and this French touch is used to show an air of class and sophistication. So while French started out as this off-brand Latin, it has grown to become a force to be reckoned with. And if you look at this very general history of French, you realize you can't learn the language without learning the culture behind it. At FluentU, we realize this, so we teach French and other languages through authentic content like YouTube videos, movie scenes, and TV clips. So if you want to learn real-world material, make sure to click that link in the description below for the free trial. Also, if you want an outline of everything that I've gone over in this video, we have a free PDF, which you can also get in the description below. And to keep learning with us here at FluentU, check out the video that's on this screen. I'll see you over there.